Welcome the Lord's chosen. Justice doesn't arrive politely, it incarnates, it interrupts, it overturns. That's not just poetry, it's the unsettling fact of history. Every empire that ever thought it was untouchable, every dynasty that believed fear would keep it alive forever, eventually met someone or something that wasn't impressed. And chosen ones? That's exactly who you are. Not an accident, not a fluke, not a motivational poster child. You are the correction written into the equation, the unpredictable element that keeps tyrants pacing at night, wondering how someone they never invited to the table suddenly holds the receipts for every hidden debt. Think about it. People aren't scared of clowns, shadows, or even horror movies as much as they are of accountability. A clown jumps out, they scream. You walk in, and they don't scream. They swallow hard, suddenly remembering every secret deal, every fake smile, every time they thought they'd get away with it. Fear isn't just in their heads. It's in their body language when you enter a room. They avoid eye contact, they change subjects, they laugh a little too loudly, like kids pretending they didn't break the vase. Spoiler, the vase is shattered, and you are the one sweeping up with receipts in hand. Chosen ones, let's be clear, you didn't incarnate to play referee or pass out participation trophies. You came here to embody justice in its rawest form. Not the courtroom kind with powdered wigs and legal jargon, but the cosmic kind that rearranges the balance sheet of humanity, the kind that says, no more, not here, not now. And the punchline, they know it. Deep down, they can sense it. That's why whispers follow you. That's why they say, something about you unsettles me. Because you weren't born to blend in. You were born to bring the overdue bill to the table. And yes, while they're sweating bullets, you're casually sipping your coffee, watching the whole show play out. Would you like me to now transition this intro into a direct setup for the 14 points, so the flow feels seamless like a storytelling arc? Number 1. You terrify them because you refuse their comfortable lie. That single act carries more weight than you may realize. Most people survive by agreeing to a shared illusion that things aren't as bad as they seem, that the rules are fair enough, that the systems they depend on may be flawed but are still safe. These illusions are like a blanket they never want taken away. But when you show up, you rip right through that cover without asking permission. You don't buy into the story, and that refusal alone is enough to make them shake. The truth is, lies are rarely about facts. They're about survival. People lie because it helps them keep their world intact. They convince themselves that if they just keep playing along, they can avoid the discomfort of facing what's broken. But when someone like you refuses to nod and smile, it breaks their spell. You're proof that the lie is not universal. And the moment they see you standing outside of it, their entire construction feels fragile. That's not just unsettling, it's terrifying. It's not even about what you say out loud. It's the way your presence contradicts their performance. You don't laugh at jokes meant to cover up cruelty. You don't clap for achievements that were bought, not earned. You don't applaud leaders who thrive on manipulation. Your refusal to participate turns their charade into what it always was, a stage play for an audience that no longer exists, and that is unbearable to them. Here's the part that stings the most. Deep down, they know you're right. They know the lie is unsustainable, but they've built their comfort, their reputation, even their identity on it. So your refusal feels like demolition. They don't just fear your words, they fear what your existence reveals, that the safety net they thought they had is nothing but smoke. And once someone has seen the smoke for what it is, they can't unsee it. That is why they fear you. Not because you're loud or threatening, but because you quietly refuse to keep their illusion alive. Number 2, justice to you is surgical, not theatrical. That's what unsettles them the most. They're used to justice being loud, messy, and performative, something that looks good on camera, wins applause, or gets reduced to hashtags and slogans. They're comfortable with that kind of justice because it's predictable. It makes noise, then fades, leaving the system untouched. But when you show up, you don't go for the noise. You go for the root. You don't swing wildly, hoping to make a statement. You cut precisely where the infection lives, and that's a kind of justice they can't prepare for. Your method is terrifying because it doesn't waste time proving a point. You don't need to drag anyone into a spotlight or gather a cheering crowd before you act. You don't move for spectacle, you move for change. That means when you step in, things actually shift. Rules stop working the way they used to. loopholes close. The power they leaned on disappears. It isn't flashy, but it's irreversible. And that's what scares them most. You're not trying to look powerful, you're quietly rearranging the ground beneath their feet. The surgical approach also means you don't strike at random. You're deliberate, you study, you observe, and then you make the one cut that removes the rot completely. That leaves them with no chance to spin the story, no time to gather sympathy, no space to play the victim. By the time they even notice the damage is done, the structure is changed, and their advantage is gone. They can't fight it because they don't see it coming. It feels unfair to them, not because it's unjust, but because it's effective. They're addicted to drama. Shouting matches, staged conflicts, endless cycles that exhaust everyone but never solve anything. You don't give them that theater. You give them outcomes. And in a world addicted to performance, outcomes are the most shocking act of all. That's why your justice is feared. It doesn't just sting, it permanently alters the landscape, quietly, surgically, and without asking for applause. Number 3. Fear is their admission of guilt in advance. It shows up in ways they can't even control. The nervous laugh, the darting eyes, the sudden shift in tone when you walk in. They don't need to be accused because their own reaction has already betrayed them. When someone is innocent, they don't carry that weight. But when guilt lives in their chest, the presence of someone who represents truth feels like exposure. You don't even have to speak. Their fear speaks louder than anything you could ever say. That's the secret no one likes to admit. Fear isn't random. It has a source, a root, a reason. People aren't scared of you because of how you look or how you sound. They're scared because something about you reminds them of what they've buried. You are living proof that the lies they depend on won't last forever. The tremor in their voice, the sudden defensiveness, the way they overcompensate with charm, all of it is a confession. And in those moments they tell on themselves without even realizing it. The irony is that fear exposes them faster than any investigation could. They think they're hiding, but fear doesn't let them. It leaks through their body language, their excuses, their avoidance. Fear becomes the signal flare that says, I know I'm guilty, I know I've played a part, and I know the reckoning is near. They don't mean to broadcast it, but they can't help it. That's why your presence is so unsettling. You don't even need to accuse them. Their guilt pre-accuses itself. This is why fear is powerful. It strips away the mask before you ever touch it. It reveals what people hoped would never surface. And when guilt hides in the dark, fear is the crack that lets the light through. That's why they're unsettled around you. It's not paranoia, it's recognition. They're not scared of you for no reason. They're scared because deep down they know what they've done, and you are the reminder they can no longer escape. Number 4. You rewrite consequences while they argue semantics. They debate definitions. You change outcomes. That's the cruel math that keeps them awake. While they sit in rooms polishing language and reclassifying wrongdoing into softer categories, you're already moving the pieces that actually matter, closing loopholes, rerouting resources, and rewriting incentives, so their clever wordplay no longer protects them. Talk can be endless and intoxicating. Action is finite and unforgiving. The moment you shift from argument to alteration, their semantics stop being a shield and start being a tombstone. Words are their refuge because words are reversible. They can edit a statement, spin a narrative, or reinterpret intent. Outcomes are not. When you alter the distribution of power, when funds stop flowing into their pockets, when contracts are rewritten so exploitation is no longer profitable, language loses its power to hide harm. They've trained themselves to win conversations. You train systems to produce different results. That difference feels like betrayal to them because it dismantles the very skill set they used to survive. Changing outcomes doesn't require drama, it requires precision, identifying the exact mechanism that lets harm persist and flipping it. It might mean redirecting influence, rewriting a policy, or exposing a chain of favors so it can't be used again. Those are technical moves that don't make headlines but change lives permanently. For people who built empires on ambiguity, permanence is worse than punishment. It removes the option to bluff, to stall, to outwait a scandal. That takes away their favorite tool, time. Their arguments about terms and intent become noise in the face of altered realities. Contracts that once benefited them get amended. Regulatory gaps they exploited get closed. Networks of patronage dry up because you've changed who benefits and who pays. It's practical, methodical, and inexorable. And because it's effective, it terrifies them more than any public spectacle ever could. They used to win by keeping the debate alive long enough for people to forget. You win by ensuring the debate no longer matters because the system itself has been reset. That balance between endless talk and decisive effect is where your power lives, and it is the thing they fear most. Number 5, your empathy is a verdict, not a weakness. When you feel the damage others ignore, you don't soften the response, you sharpen the remedy. Most people treat empathy as a private condolence, a quiet feeling that lets them nod and move on. You treat it as evidence, concrete data about who lost what, how pain was manufactured, and where the system profited from that pain. That turns compassion into strategy. Instead of pity, you produce fixes. Instead of sympathy, you produce reversals. That shift is brutal for those who built comfort out of other people's brokenness. They rely on sentimental language to mask structural theft. They plaster care over policies that extract value and then point to their online expressions of concern when anyone calls them out. Your kind of empathy refuses that theater. You catalog harm, translate it into accountability, and reshape institutions so the same harm can't happen again. For them, that's a death sentence for their business model. They can survive a few embarrassed tweets. They cannot survive a system that no longer rewards the behavior they engineered. Empathy as a verdict also removes the easy escape of individual blame. You punish the system because you understand how the system uses people as levers. That scares them because systems are harder to rebuild than people are to shame. When you dismantle an entire incentive structure, there's no scapegoat to burn, only repair work that reassigns resources and power. That permanence is what devastates those who hid behind performative sentiment. Their moral theater made them powerful. Your moral clarity makes them obsolete. Finally, your empathy forces a recalibration of value. It makes the losses visible in spreadsheets, budgets, and policy drafts. It turns someone's quiet suffering into a line item that can no longer be ignored. That translation from feeling to enforceable fact is what stops gossip from staying gossip and turns it into law, policy, or restored equity. They're terrified because empathy used this way isn't flattering. It's corrective, it's structural, and it's final. That is why your compassion terrifies them more than their own bravado ever could. Number 6, you treat truth as an operational tool, not a debating point. That's where the ground shifts beneath them. Most people are comfortable with truth as something to argue over, stretch, reinterpret, or bury under technicalities. They've trained themselves to survive in the gray zones where definitions can be bent and facts delayed until they're no longer useful. For them, truth is fluid, something to keep in motion so no one can pin it down. But you don't handle truth like that. You treat it as a lever, a key, a switch. Once it's in your hands, it stops being a topic of conversation and starts being the foundation of action. That's what frightens them. Because truth in motion can be spun, but truth in operation cannot be dodged. When you take a fact and build systems or decisions around it, you close doors they used to slip through. Their excuses, their fine print, their legal gymnastics. All of it collapses when truth is no longer up for debate, but embedded into how things function. Suddenly, the same fact they dismissed as just your perspective becomes the rule that determines where money goes, how justice is enforced, or who loses power. They call you dangerous because you don't wait for consensus. You don't give them the comfort of endless arguments that lead nowhere. You identify what's real, strip away the noise, and then let reality dictate the outcome. That means the conversation ends where they hoped it would drag on. That means loopholes close where they hoped they'd remain open. That means consequences arrive where they thought delay would buy them safety. To them it feels like betrayal, but in truth it's simply exposure. You've robbed them of the one thing they depend on most, the ability to turn truth into a toy, a bargaining chip, a debate club exercise. When you operationalize truth, it grows teeth, it rearranges the system itself. And once a system digests truth, no amount of clever arguing can undo the outcome. That's why they fear you, because truth in your hands is no longer negotiable, it's enforceable. Number 7, you make silence dangerous for the complicit. Silence was their insurance policy. It kept favors unpaid, deals hidden, and responsibility anonymous. When you make silence dangerous for the complicit, you remove that policy and replace it with liability. Naming what is happening in clear language with records and witnesses turns quiet collusion into active risk. People who once relied on the comfort of hush now find themselves gambling with consequences instead of hiding behind them. That shift is not theatrical. It is surgical and relentlessly procedural. You do not need a spectacle to topple protection. A detailed record, a strict timeline, and consistent accounts are enough to convert comfortable secrecy into prosecutable exposure. Once silence carries cost, the calculus changes. Allies who stayed quiet to avoid trouble start to assess personal risk. Opportunists begin choosing sides. Networks built on mutual discretion fracture because discretion now equals danger. The single most dangerous assumption for the complicit has always been that time will erase evidence. You strip that assumption away by anchoring truth in documentation and outcomes. This approach also collapses plausible deniability. When accountability is paired with documentation and public clarity, denials become weak theater. People who relied on ambiguous phrasing and forgotten memos watch their cover stories shrink as records and testimony line up. The social pressure that once enforced silence flips into social currency for truth-tellers. Testimony stops being martyrdom and becomes leverage, and leverage changes incentives more reliably than outrage ever could. When incentives shift, behavior follows. Corruption loses its sustenance. Fear spreads fast when silence is no longer safe. Panic replaces complacency because the complicit understand how fragile the architecture of collusion really is. Small admissions can start cascades that rearrange power and influence. That is when deals unravel, alliances shift, and people who thought themselves untouchable begin answering hard questions they tried to outsource. You make silence dangerous not by noise but by turning information into enforceable action. And in doing so, you change the cost-benefit equation that once protected them. You transform the quiet into risk and accountability for all. Their comfort dissolves because their choices finally have visible consequences. Number 8, you reveal leverage they thought was private. When people build power, they do it with quiet agreements and soft contracts, favors whispered in corridors, off-the-record accounts, informal promises that live in memory more than on paper. Those invisible threads are the real currency of influence because they let people act without scrutiny. You make those threads visible, and in doing so, you dismantle the whole economy that depended on shade. You don't need drama to do it. A single confirmed ledger entry, a recorded call, or a chain of emails turns rumor into fact. That's the point. You convert what was private into verifiable evidence. Once evidence exists, the leverage evaporates. Loans that were never meant to be repaid become traceable. Preferential contracts show their signatures. The handshake deals that move billions into private pockets show the fingerprints of specific people. Exposure makes the hidden costly in ways applause never could. This is terrifying for them because what they counted on wasn't force. It was plausible secrecy. They relied on favors that could be denied, accounts that could be rewritten, and alliances that could be forgotten if anyone got uncomfortable. You are the person who refuses to let that forgetfulness stand. By mapping the invisible networks, who called whom, who benefited when policy changed, who opened doors for whom, you make it impossible to treat corruption as an abstract problem. It becomes a list of names and transfers and decisions, and lists are difficult to spin away. Revealing leverage also changes incentives. Once those hidden advantages are public, allies start recalculating loyalties. People who accepted favors for convenience start worrying about association, reputation, and legal exposure. Pressure mounts not because of moral theater, but because practical risks appear. Frozen accounts, revoked contracts, lost business. The architecture that supported their advantage collapses because it was never robust, only secretive. You don't simply expose impropriety, you remove the utility of secrecy. When shadow deals can be turned into enforceable claims, secrecy stops being a strategy and becomes liability. That is why shining light where they banked on shadow is the most efficient way to neutralize power. You don't fight their lies. You erase their hiding places. And without hiding places, their hold on influence dissolves. Number 9. Your presence destabilizes their future plans. Their long-term plans collapse because you are the unpredictable factor they never accounted for. Power is built on patterns, and their strategies assume routines will continue, favors will be repaid on schedule, regulations will drift, and attention will move on. They draft 5- and 10-year roadmaps that rely on inertia, slow decay, manageably corrupt deals, predictable allies. When you enter the equation, you change the math. Your presence injects variance. Delays become abrupt stops, trust turns tentative, and a carefully timed advantage suddenly falls apart. They plan in spreadsheets and scenarios that assume a stable baseline. That baseline collapses when someone like you refuses to play by the old rules. Projects valued for their future yield suddenly look risky because you interfere with the mechanisms that harvest those yields. Investments meant to compound off quiet advantages now hit friction. Pipelines of influence that expected gradual returns instead face closure. The most elegant part of your disruption is how mundane it looks. A policy tweak here, a shadow contract made visible there, a recalculated budget that removes a corrupt subsidy. Those small adjustments aren't dramatic on their own, but together they rewrite forecasts. Their fear is practical, not purely moral. Forecasts fail when variables change. They can survive scandals if they can still predict revenue, control supply, or count on loyalty. You remove predictability. Allies become liabilities, vendors reprice services, boards demand audits. What used to be a comfortable horizon now resembles a shifting coastline where no one can plant a flag. Uncertainty forces rushed decisions, panic-driven loyalty tests, and short-termism that erodes long-term power faster than any protest. Destabilizing future plans is a surgical pressure point because it turns advantage into fragility. When their models stop working, options shrink. They can no longer stall or outweight consequences. They must adapt, lose leverage, or collapse. That compression of choice accelerates exposure and forces realignment of resources away from their schemes. Quiet, consistent unpredictability removes the safety net they built around time itself, and that is why your presence is the variable they fear above all else. Number 10, you punish hypocrisy with structural remedies, not spectacle. Hypocrites thrive on noise. They know public shame burns hot but fades quickly, and they've mastered the art of outlasting outrage. When the crowd moves on, they slip right back into the same patterns, untouched at the core. That's why your approach is terrifying to them. You don't waste time creating a scene. You remove the very gears that make hypocrisy function. Once those gears are gone, their performance collapses on its own. They expect to be called out, maybe even humiliated for a season, but they plan for that. They've prepared excuses, statements, and even staged redemptions to ride out the storm. What they can't prepare for is the quiet removal of loopholes, the closing of channels, or the dismantling of incentives that made their double standard profitable. You don't just point at the fire, you cut off the gas line. You don't just criticize the mask, you ban the marketplace that rewards mask wearing. That's a hit they can't bounce back from because it doesn't target their image, it targets their infrastructure. Structural remedies are permanent in a way spectacle can never be. Shame lives in headlines, but remedies live in policies, contracts, budgets, and systems. They alter how resources move, how influence flows, how opportunity is distributed. Hypocrisy feeds on an ecosystem that lets people say one thing and benefit from the opposite. By redesigning that ecosystem, you remove the soil it grows in. Suddenly, their contradictions can't hide behind popularity, charity projects, or rehearsed moral outrage. The hypocrisy becomes unprofitable, and once it loses utility, it dies. That's why your method devastates them. It doesn't just sting their ego, it erases their strategy. They can't wait out a structural change. They can't charm their way around a closed loophole. They can't survive when their old tricks no longer deliver the same rewards. You don't fight hypocrisy with fireworks. You dismantle its scaffolding. And when the scaffolding falls, the performer is left exposed, powerless, and unable to rebuild what they thought was indestructible. Number 11. You convert shame into accountability and economy. That shift is lethal to people who think public image is their only battlefield. They treat shame as noise, a bad headline, a trending hashtag, a temporary storm that can be managed with apologies, donations, or rebranding. To them, shame is theater. They play the villain one week, the repentant figure the next, and the cycle keeps their power intact. But when you step in, shame stops being cosmetic and starts being consequential. You don't let it fizzle out as gossip. You hardwire it into systems that cost them something real. You know they don't respect moral disapproval, but they do respect what empties their pockets, shrinks their influence, or locks doors they used to walk through. By converting shame into enforceable costs, lawsuits, revoked contracts, cancelled privileges, frozen accounts, policy reversals, you change the stakes of exposure. It's no longer about reputation management, it's about survival. They can rehearse their apologies 100 different ways, but no speech clears a debt, no photo op restores a seized license, no staged tears reopen a closed channel of power. That's what terrifies them. You make consequences stick. The economy of accountability you build operates in real time. Social standing, once shielded by PR, now erodes in ways they can't patch with advertising or donations. Communities redirect support. Customers and allies walk away. Institutions that once looked the other way decide the risk isn't worth it. Shame becomes not just a feeling, but a measurable decline in resources, reach and leverage. Every ounce of harm they cause starts returning as cost, recalculated and redistributed. What devastates them most is that this form of justice doesn't fade. It compounds. While shame as noise weakens over weeks, shame as cost deepens over years. It shows up in budgets, voting patterns, hiring decisions and board meetings. It infiltrates spaces they thought were safe. They lose not because people dislike them, but because the very systems they relied on now tax their hypocrisy. That is the language they finally understand, and the verdict they cannot escape. Number 12, you normalize discomfort before they can weaponize it. That's the quiet strategy that undercuts their playbook. Their whole approach is built on making dissent painful. Isolate, shame, gaslight, and watch people recoil. If discomfort is a weapon, they can swing to silence critics. Then normalizing that discomfort strips the weapon of its edge. People stop flinching. Conversations stop collapsing into personal attacks. When discomfort becomes ordinary, their threats turn into background noise, and their attempts at public shaming fall flat. Normalization is practical, not performative. It looks like steady exposure to truth without melodrama, consistent insistence on accountability, and the removal of stigma from speaking up. You make it clear that discomfort is part of change, not a sign that someone must be banished. That cultural shift shifts incentives. Allies who once stayed quiet to avoid awkwardness now see silence as complicity. Onlookers who feared being dragged into conflict start to treat hard conversations as routine civic hygiene. That erosion of fear is lethal to those who profit from silence because it starves their tactics of social power. The process also reframes who's vulnerable. Instead of looking for a single scapegoat to isolate, communities begin to treat challenge as normal and temporary, a necessary friction in the work of reform. That means the usual isolation tactic fails. There's no unanimous turn away, no rapid consensus to exclude. The person targeted finds support, not abandonment. The attacker's leverage collapses because social penalties no longer flow automatically to dissenters. More importantly, normalizing discomfort forces people to tolerate short-term awkwardness for long-term gain. Where panic once spread and decisions were rushed to avoid confrontation, deliberate choices become possible. Systems are repaired rather than defended. Habits change because people accept that being unsettled occasionally is better than pretending everything's fine forever. That incremental, steady acceptance of discomfort is how durable transformation happens. They fear it because their strongest tool is the reflexive flinch, the scramble to save face. When that reflex goes away, their methods stop working. Their threats become ineffective, their gaslighting loses traction, and their isolation strategies crumble. Normalizing discomfort doesn't make life easy, it makes it honest. And honesty is the last thing their architecture of avoidance can survive. Number 13, you outlast moral theatrics because your resolve is non-performative. While they bet everything on headlines, viral moments, and the next trending outrage, you build for the long game. Their victories are applause, yours are structure. They chase attention to cover gaps. You fix the gaps so attention no longer matters. That difference is subtle until it isn't, and then it becomes devastating. They perform morality like actors hitting cues. A staged apology, a charity photo op, a calculated expression of remorse timed to the news cycle. It buys them breathing room and sympathy long enough to patch the hole and keep the machine running. But those patches always fail because they're cosmetic. You don't invest in optics, you invest in policy, process, and persistence. You change who makes decisions, how resources are allocated, and what incentives exist. Over time, those changes outpace the next headline, and the theatrics become background noise against a new reality. Endurance is boring to them, but lethal in practice. While they rehearse narratives, you quietly alter budgets, rewrite rules, and reassign accountability. Those moves are slow and technical, and they don't make good sound bites. That's exactly the point. The work is durable because it's procedural, not performative. It survives attention cycles, staff changes, and PR councils. It reconfigures how things operate so that even if a scandal is forgotten, the exploit that created it cannot easily return. Systems-level fixes also remove the temptation to rely on charisma and crisis management. When the institution itself enforces fairness, individual reputations matter less. The next time someone tries to cobble together a dramatic comeback, they find fewer doors open. Allies who once rallied around spectacle now have to reckon with rules they can't control with spin. That steady, cumulative pressure drains the power of showmanship because showmanship needs a stage that still exists. Being non-performative isn't noble theater, it's tactical patience. It's trading a viral moment for a durable change. And because people in power are optimized to survive noise, enduring structural change is the real threat. Their theatrics die a slow, humiliating death when they can't use attention to rebuild what you took away. That slow death is your victory. Number 14, they fear you because you don't want permission. You bring consequences. That truth lands like a scalpel in a room full of negotiators who thought everything could be deferred until consensus arrived. For them, survival means staying within the polite bounds of consent. Get the nod, secure the sign-off, buy time with committees and memos. You ignore that choreography. You don't wait for approval or theatrical consensus. You identify what's harmful and you remove the advantage. That refusal to negotiate permission strips away their safety net. Permission is a smokescreen they learn to rely on. It lets them say later that they followed process, that someone higher up approved the move, or that circumstances forced their hand. When consequences replace permission, those excuses collapse. A decision doesn't become reversible just because it was popular in the right room. You translate wrongdoing into tangible costs. Withdrawn contracts, clawed back funds, restructured authority. And once the cost is real, the quaint fiction of "we asked and were allowed" no longer protects them. The result is finality, and finality is terrifying. They can survive judgment because judgment is temporary. It burns and then cools. They can weather a scandal if they can appeal, rebrand, or stall. But structural alteration doesn't evaporate with headlines. It changes how systems allocate power, how money moves, and who controls access. It rewrites incentives so that the behaviors that once rewarded them now punish them. That kind of change forces long-term recalculation. Reputations, revenue streams, alliances, all of it must adapt or disappear. They dread that because adaptation is costly and often impossible without losing the core of what made them powerful. Bringing consequences also removes the theater of moral bargaining. Where permission invites negotiation, consequences enforce closure. There is no comfortable deal to broker when institutions are rewritten to prevent the same harm from recurring. For people built on permission, that closure feels absolute. It doesn't bruise their ego, it dismantles the very systems they relied upon. That irreversible certainty, the knowledge that some doors are now permanently closed, is what terrifies them most. You are not asking for a seat at the table. You are taking away the table. Justice doesn't roar through theatrics, and it doesn't beg for acknowledgement. It simply rewrites the script. Chosen ones, that's what you've done across every fault line of power. You've shown that fear is not proof of your danger, but of their guilt. That truth is not up for debate, but for enforcement. That empathy is not a weakness, but a verdict that restructures the game. Where they depended on silence, you made silence costly. Where they relied on shadow, you dragged shadow into the ledger. Where they trusted attention cycles, you built systems that outlasted every performance. Your presence is the variable they can't calculate, the disruption their models can't withstand. You don't traffic in shame as noise. You convert it into costs that strip away their profit. You don't punish hypocrisy with hashtags. You dismantle the scaffolding it stands on. You don't ask permission to act. You bring consequences that cannot be reversed. And that is why they whisper about you with dread. Not because you shout the loudest, but because your quiet resolve makes their theatrics irrelevant and their comfort unsustainable. This is what it means to incarnate justice, not to chase applause or live in spectacle, but to alter the very soil where corruption once thrived. That alteration is permanent, it is systemic, it is final. And that is the destiny of the chosen, to be the shift they never saw coming, the recalibration they cannot undo, the living reminder that no empire, no mask, no shadowed scheme survives the weight of truth enforced. You are not their fear, you are their ending. And the story they wrote without you cannot continue now that you've arrived. If this message hit you with the clarity and fire it was meant to, don't just walk away. Subscribe to the channel and join the movement of minds refusing to settle for illusions. Hit that like button to fuel the content that cuts through noise. Drop a comment and let your voice echo. Your insight matters here. Share this with someone who needs the wake-up call, because change doesn't travel silently. Be part of the audience that doesn't just watch justice unfold, but carries it forward. Stay blessed, always.